Today I would like to look at group dynamics, compliance and obedience. The main objectives in this lesson are to understand the nature of compliance and related techniques, the meaning of obedience and allied research studies. Now that we have discussed in detail about the first form of social influence called conformity, let us acquaint ourselves with the other forms of social influence called compliance and obedience. Cialdini and his colleagues work on compliance, the tactics based on friendship or liking in terms of ingratiation, the foot in the door, the low ball techniques, the play hard to get, the fast approaching deadline techniques, symbolic social influence. Later we will discuss about obedience, Milgram's study and various aspects of obedience. Robert Cialdini, a well-known social psychologist, decided that the best way to find out about compliance was to study what he termed compliance professionals. These are people whose success depends on their ability to get others to say yes. They include salespeople, advertisers, political lobbyists, fundraisers, politicians, artists, professional negotiators and others. His technique for learning from these people was simple. He temporarily concealed the true identity and took jobs in various settings where gaining compliance is a way of life. In other words, he worked in advertising, that is door-to-door sales. On the basis of these first-hand experiences, he concluded that although techniques for gaining compliance in many different forms, they all rest to some degree on a 6-base principle approach. The first one is friendship or liking. In general, we are more willing to comply with requests from friends or from people whom we like than from strangers or those whom we don't like. The second one is commitment or consistency. We have committed ourselves to a position or action and then we are more willing to comply with requests or behaviors that are consistent with this position or action than with requests which are inconsistent with it. The third one is scarcity. In general, we value and try to secure outcomes or objectives that are scarce or decreasing in availability. As a result, we are more likely to comply with requests that focus on scarcity than ones that make no reference to these issues. The fourth one is reciprocity. We are generally more willing to comply with a request from someone who has previously provided a favor or concession to us than to someone who has not. In other words, we feel obligated to pay back, right? Social validation and proof. The fifth one, we are generally more willing to comply with the request or action if this action is consistent with what we believe people similar to ourselves are doing or thinking. We want to be correct, and one way to do so is to act and think like others. The sixth one, authority. In general, we are more willing to comply with requests from someone who holds legitimate authority or simply appears to do so. According to research studies by Cialdini again, these basic principles underlie many techniques used by the professionals and sometimes even ourselves to gain compliance from others. We shall now examine techniques based on these principles and a few others as well. Now let's look at the tactics based on friendship or liking, ingratiation. Impression management techniques are often used for the purpose of ingratiation, which is getting others to like us so that they will be more willing to agree to our requests. What is this technique? A review of existing studies in the recent 90s and 2000, they suggest that flattery or praising others in some manner is one of the best known. Another is self-promotion, informing others about our past accomplishments or positive characteristics. For example, I am really very organized or I am very easy to get along with. The other techniques that seem to work are improving one's own appearance, emitting many positive nonverbal cues, doing small favors for the target people, etc. Therefore, many tactics are used for the purpose of impression management. Still another means of increasing others' liking for us and thus increasing the chances that they will agree to requests we make involves what has been termed incidental similarity, that is, calling attention to small and slightly surprising similarities between them and ourselves. Tactics based on commitment or consistency, the foot in the door technique and the low ball technique. When you visit a shopping mall, are you ever approached by people who are offering you free samples of food? If so, why do they do this? The answer is simple. They know that once you have accepted the small free gift, you will be more willing to buy something from there. This is the basic idea behind an approach for gaining compliance known as the foot in the door technique. This involves inducing target people to agree to a small initial request, accept this free sample and then making a larger request, the one desired all along. The results of many studies indicate that this tactic works and it succeeds in inducing increased compliance. This is supported by research by Freedom and Fraser in 1966. Now, why is this case? Because the foot in the door technique rests on the principle of consistency. Once we have said yes to the small request, we are more likely to say yes to subsequent and larger ones also. Now, let us look at the low ball procedure. In this procedure, which is often used by automobile salespersons, a very good deal is offered to a customer. After the customer accepts, however, something happens that makes it necessary for the salesperson to change the deal and make it a bit uneasy for the customer. The totally rational response for the customers, of course, is to walk away. Yet, often they agree to the changes and accept the less desirable arrangement. Tactics based on reciprocity, the door in the face, and that's not all approach. Reciprocity is a basic rule of social life. We usually do unto others as they have done unto us. If they have done a favor for us, therefore we feel that we should be willing to do one for them in return. While this is viewed by most people as being fair and unjust, the principle of reciprocity also serves as a basis for several techniques for gaining compliance. One of these is on the face of it, the opposite of foot in the door technique. Instead of beginning with small request and then escalating to larger one, people seeking compliance sometimes start with a very large request and then after this is rejected, shift to a smaller request, the one they wanted all along. The tactic is known as door in the face technique because the first refusal seems to slam the door in the face of the requester, and several studies indicate that it can be quite effective. For example, in one known experiment, Cialdini and his colleagues 1975 stopped college students on the street and presented a huge request. Would the students serve as unpaid counselors for juvenile delinquents for 2 hours a week for the next 2 years? As you can guess, no one agreed. And when the experimenters then scaled down the request to a much smaller one, would the same students take a group of delinquents on a 2-hour trip to the zoo? Yes, a full 50% agreed. In contrast, less than 17% of those in a control group agreed to this smaller request when it was presented cold rather than after the larger request. Recently, it has been found that this tactic works on the internet as well as in face-to-face situations. Higher percentages of the door in the face group than the control group went to the donation page and activated the link to make donations. Clearly, this tactic can work in cyberspace as well as in person. The "that's not all" technique. A related procedure for gaining compliance is known as the "that's not all" technique. Here, an initial request is followed, and before the target person can say yes or no by something that sweetens the deal, say for example, a small extra incentive from the people using this tactic, a reduction in price or a small fruit which is given as a sample, etc. Television advertisements for various products frequently offer something extra to induce viewers to pick up the phone and place an order. For instance, a free item. Several studies confirm informational observations suggesting "that's not all" technique really works. And why is this so? One possibility is that this tactic succeeds because it is based on the principle of reciprocity. People on the receiving end of this approach view the extra thrown in by the other side as an added concession and so feel obligated to make a concession themselves. The result, they are more likely to say yes. Tactics based on scarcity. Here we look at playing hard to get and the fast approaching deadline technique. It is a general rule of life that things that are scarce, rare or difficult to obtain are viewed as being priced than the others. Thus, we are often willing to expend more effort or to greater expense obtain outcomes that are scarce than to obtain the ones that are large in supply. This principle serves as the foundation for several techniques for gaining compliance. One of the most common is the playing hard to get, which is a tactic often used in the area of romance. What it involves is actions by a person using this technique suggesting that they have very little interest in the target person, the one toward whom playing hard to get is directed. The playing hard to get tactic not only limited to dating and romance, however, research findings indicate that it is also sometimes used by job candidates to increase their attractiveness to potential employers and hence to increase the likelihood that these employers will offer them a job. People using this tactic let the potential employer know that they have offers and so are very desirable employee. A related procedure also based on the what scarce is valuable principle is one frequently used at the supermarkets. Advertisements using this deadline technique state that a special sale will end on a certain date, implying that after that the prices will go up. In many cases, time limit is false or the prices won't go up after the indicated date and may in fact continue to drop if the merchandise remains unsold. This may be simply a technique for boosting sales. In closing, there are many different tactics for gaining compliance, for changing others' ways of behavior, and such efforts work both ways. We try to influence others and they in turn often attempt to influence us. Symbolic social influence. How we are influenced by others even when they are not there. Imagined presence or implied presence. The fact that other people can influence us when they are present and trying to do so is not surprising. They have many techniques at their disposal for getting us to say, think or do what they want. But growing evidence suggests that others can influence us even when they are not present and not trying to change our behavior or thoughts. Ultimately, of course, other people do not produce such effects, we do. Our mental representations of others or what they want to prefer and our relationships with them, how we think they would evaluate us or our current actions can exert powerful effects on us even if it appears we are not consciously aware that they are occurring. For example, in one well-known study which initially triggered interest in this topic, Baldwin, Carroll and Lopez in 1990 found that graduate students evaluated their own research ideas more negatively after being exposed subliminally to the picture of their not so very friendly head of the department. Now, let us move on to obedience, another major type of social influence. Here, one person directly orders one or more others to behave in specific ways. Obedience is less frequent than conformity or compliance because even when people who possess authority and could use it often prefer to exert influence in less obvious ways through requests rather than direct orders, obedience occurs in many settings. It ranges from schools to military bases. Obedience to the commands of people who possess authority is far from surprising, and they usually have effective means for enforcing their orders. More unexpected is the fact that often people lacking in such power can also induce high levels of submission from others. The clearest and most dramatic evidence for such effects was supported by Stanley Milgram in a series of famous but still controversial studies, 1960s and the 70s. Research studies on obedience. In his research, Milgram wished to find out whether individuals would obey commands from a relatively less powerless stranger, requiring them to inflict a considerable pain on the other person, that is, a totally innocent stranger. In an effort to gain insight into the nature of such events, Milgram designed an laboratory simulation. The experimenter informed participants in the study, all males, that they were taking part in an investigation of the effects of punishment on learning. And one person in each pair of the participants would serve as learner and would try to perform a simple task involving memory, supplying the second word in pairs of words they had previously memorized after hearing only the first word. Here we see Milgram's experiment setting. The other participant, who is the teacher, would read these words to the learner and would punish errors by the learner, the failure to provide the second word in each pair. The punishment would be through an electric shock, and these shocks would be delivered by means of equipment shown in the figure. And this device contained 30 numbered switches ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts, which is the 30th. The teacher was then told to deliver the shock to the learner each time and made an error on the task. Moreover, the teachers were told to increase the strength of the shock each time the learner made an error. In reality, the assistant or the learner never received any shocks during the experiment. The only real shock used was a mild pulse from a button, number 3, to convince the participants that yes, the equipment was real. During the session, the learner prearranged instructions made many errors. Participants soon found themselves facing a dilemma. Should they continue punishing this person with what seemed to be increasingly painful shocks, or should they refuse? Since all the participants were volunteers and paid in advance, you might predict that most would quickly refuse. In reality, full 65% showed total obedience. They proceeded through the entire series to the final 450 volt level. Many participants, of course, protested and asked that the session be ended. When ordered to proceed, however, a majority yielded to the experimenter's influence and continued to obey. Similarly, a large proportion continued to obey even when the accomplice complained about the painfulness of the shocks and begged to be released. More surprisingly, 30% obeyed even when they were required to grasp the victim's hand and force it down on the metal shock plate. These results are not restricted to a single culture and are indicated by the fact that similar findings were reported in several countries such as Jordan, Germany and Australia, and also it was the same case with children as well. Psychologists and the public both found Milgram's results highly disturbing. His studies seem to suggest that ordinary people are willing, with some reluctance, to harm an innocent stranger if ordered to do so by someone in authority. Destructive obedience, why it occurs. Social psychologists have identified several factors that seem to play a role, and together these combine to make an array of situational pressures, and most people find it very hard to resist. First, in many situations, the people in authority relieve those who obey the responsibility for their own actions. In life situations, this transfer of responsibility may be implicit. The person in charge, for example, the military or police officer, is assumed to have responsibility for what happens. In Milgram's experiments, this transfer of responsibility was explicit. That means the participants were told at the start that the experimenter or the authority figure and not they would be responsible for the learner's well-being. In view of this fact, it is not surprising that many obeyed. People in authority often possess visible badges or signs, and this depicts their status. They wear special uniforms and have special titles and so on. These serve to remind many individuals of the social norm: obey people in charge, and this is a very powerful norm. In Milgram's study, the experimenter wore a white lab coat, which suggested that he was a doctor or someone with authority. A third reason for obedience in many situations where the targets of such influence might otherwise resist involves the gradual escalation of the authority figure's orders. A social psychological analysis of the conditions existing both in Milgram's experiment and in many real life situations identifies several factors that together make it very difficult for individuals to resist the commands they receive. The consequences, of course, can be truly tragic for innocent and often defenseless victims. Now, let us look at the next subtopic, destructive obedience and resisting its effects. Individuals can be provided with a clear indication that beyond some point, total submission to destructive commands is inappropriate. One procedure that can be effective in this regard involves exposing individuals to the actions of disobedient models, that is, people who refuse to obey an authority figure's commands. Some individuals may also find it easier to resist influence from authority figures if they question the expertise and motives of these figures. Dictators always claim that their brutal orders reflect their undying concern for their fellow citizens and are in their best interest. But to the extent large numbers of people question these motives, the power of such dictators can perhaps be ultimately swept away. Finally, simply knowing about the power of authority figures to command blind obedience may be helpful in itself. The power of authority figures seems to command obedience to a great deal. That is what we see. And it is not irresistible. Under appropriate conditions, it can be countered or reduced. In many areas of life, there is a choice. Deciding to resist the commands of people in authority can, of course, be highly dangerous. They usually control most of the weapons, the army and the police. Let us learn that power is never permanent, and ultimately victory often goes to those who stand for freedom in decency rather than those who wish to control the lives of their fellow human beings. So, obedience is a form of social influence in which one person orders one or more others to do something and they do so. It is, in one sense, the most direct form of social influence. What did we learn today? We have learned about compliance and obedience and the tactics involved, and learned about related research studies.